So our last session covered searching. We won't be covering searching again today, other than some specific searches that you might want to use in your regular data management practices. One of the things I really hope that you will do during this session is if you have any particular tricks or advice that you want to share with others during the process, please feel free to post it as a question, and I can share it with everyone. As I say, I usually have an assistant, so please be patient with me. I have no assistant today to monitor the questions in the training session, so it's a little bit more of a challenge than last time. So the first thing I'm going to talk about today is the difference between updating a record and record feedback. And although that might seem basic to some of you who've been doing this forever, we do have some people who are new to CIOC, so we do have to start from the very, very basics. So within CIOC, we have two ways to enter a change to a record. We have update record and suggest an update. Your ability to do update record depends entirely on your permissions. You may be able to update all the records in your view. You may be able to update only records that are from your agency, or you may not be able to update records at all. But every single user, no matter what their security is, including the public, has the ability to suggest an update, that's the same as feedback, for any in the database. Suggest an update actually works even if the record is not available in the particular view. So suggest an update is always, always, always available, no matter what view, no matter what your security is. You can always perform suggest an update on any record in the database. Suggest an update doesn't actually make a change to the record. Rather, it's a way for you to pass on your changes to the person who has the ability to do a full update of the record. So if you have the ability to update a record, obviously doing a suggest an update does not generally make a lot of sense for most people. The only time that it is even remotely useful to do a suggest an update if you have the ability to update the record is if you want to do some kind of extra maintenance around some of the publication fields, because the one feature that suggest an update has that update a record doesn't have is the ability to view all of the publication information within the suggest an update form. For everyone else, we have update publications as a separate management tool from updating the record itself. Similarly, update service categories, which is how we maintain the taxonomy, is a completely separate management item from the main updating of the record or the updating of the publication. And again, the suggest an update also would cover any suggestions towards updating the taxonomy. So whereas the actual changing of the record, these are three different management items, update record, update service categories, and update publications. Suggest an update where the user receives a single form but can't actually change the record can, if you want, cover all of those items. So it can cover any aspect of the record that no matter whether it's a separate management item for the person who is actually doing the update. Suggest an update would contain all aspects of the record in one form, but it does not actually make changes to the record. When I submit feedback for a record, I'm going to make a change to a few different kinds of fields. In this case, a text field. I'm going to do one in a drop-down field. I'm going to do one in a multi-part field, in this case the address. I'm going to make a change in a checkbox field. Find one. which would be, let's do area served. At the bottom of every feedback form, we have a place to collect information from the person who's submitting the suggestion, which has nothing to do with the actual changes to the record itself. This is broken out into 3 or 4 different areas, potentially more, depending on the setup of the form. The first section is about the source of the information. In the case of public feedback, so someone who's not a staff member, this would be the actual individual who is filling out the form. In the case of a staff-submitted update, the source is generally the person at the organization who was consulted on which to, as a basis to make the change to the record. So it would not be you personally, rather it would be the third-party source of the information, the person who is responsible for providing the accurate information here, rather than the person or the staff member who is filling out the form. So you'll notice if you view this as a public feedback form, rather than saying source of this information, it will say about you. But in both cases, the information that's submitted is used for exactly the same purpose, and that is it's a potential update to the source fields of the record. So it's identifying who the source of the information, the third-party source, so not the staff members at your organization, but rather the person at the organization that you're updating who is responsible for providing this information and potentially keeping it up to date. Next, we have a section on special instructions. Just a note to the person who will be reviewing the information to tell them any special information about the update. Often in my experience, the special instructions field is used when staff are submitting changes to other agencies in the same database. Rather than even going and making the specific change, they'll just really quickly dash off a note in special instructions saying that they found a particular issue and prompting the data manager to do something about it. In the case of the public, give them the opportunity to give any other information that they may need to pass along. That special instructions is never stored anywhere within the record itself. Rather, it's available at the top of the screen when the person is actually updating the record and reviewing the feedback. There may or may not be a terms of use policy, depending on the setup in the database. The terms of use policy should outline which records are to be submitted to the database and under what conditions. So it may include some specific instructions on what kinds of information are allowed in the description or what kinds of records are available. This section is called the Data Use Authorization section, so it may or may not be available depending on what the setup in your view is. The Data Use Authorization section is where there's the ability to indicate whether the person who has provided the information is allowing this information to be used and under what circumstances. So the values that you see here change depending on whether or not this is a staff review or whether this is the public that is submitting a request. So in this case, because this is a staff submission of feedback, you have the ability to denote that this is just an internal review of the information, and it's particularly targeted about whether you received authorization from the source, rather than saying that you personally are authorizing the information. Again, this information isn't automatically stored anywhere in the record, so if you do receive any specific information about the authorization in terms of how you are permitted to use the information, you will be responsible for ensuring that that information is captured somewhere in the record, such as the internal memo. In the future, we do hope to be able to actually store that information in its own field rather than having to put the responsibility on you to capture that information somewhere else. you must select at least one of these. In this case, I want to show you what this looks like, so I'm going to show you what it would look like if I selected a couple of different types of authorization. And finally, there's a place to indicate what the status of this particular review is. So a complete update would imply that every single piece of information about this record has been reviewed and all necessary corrections are made. You also can say that you reviewed it but no changes are required. So if you're sending out a request to someone to review and update their information and they didn't actually have to change anything, but you want to be able to process and update the update date of that record and show that you have done a proper review of that record, it gives you a chance to do that. And then, of course, there's the ability to say that this was just a small correction or that the record isn't valid and you want to remove it. At the end, there is a section that's only available to staff members and only depending on their permission, whether or not they are allowed to block these notifications. So in my case, I have the ability to decide whether or not to send out notifications when this change is submitted. Notify agency means that when this change is submitted, a notice with all of the changes will be sent to the contact person listed in the record. That will either be the update contact email or it may be the organization email, depending on what's available in the record. And that would give them an opportunity to review these changes and ensure that no mistakes were made, either in the data entry process or in the case of public feedback, if the suggestions were made by someone who wasn't authorized to make those changes, it means that that organization has a chance to flag to you that there was a problem. So I really do recommend that you notify the agency, even as a staff person, notify the agency when any substantial changes are made, because it does give them the opportunity to make sure that there haven't been any mistakes made in the data entry and that everything was authorized. For minor changes, it's often better to not notify the agency if you know there isn't an issue, because obviously too many emails from you annoy the person who has been noted as receiving emails from the system. So whenever possible, we do want to reduce the number of emails that get sent to people just to keep them from getting frustrated and annoyed and you getting a request to not send them emails anymore. Finally, there is the ability to notify the record administrator. Every single agency that has been set up properly in the database has an email associated with it that receives notifications when someone suggests changes to a record, unless you block it like I have here. So for internal staff changes, depending on the nature of the change, you may not care about notifying that email address. However, if the change that you are submitting is to another agency in your database, you may want to consciously choose to notify them and send them an email so they are aware that a change has been submitted, as opposed to updating or suggesting an update to a record in your own agency. There's a high likelihood that you've already had an internal communication about the fact that that change has been submitted and it isn't necessary to send that to the administrator. Okay. Once I've submitted that suggest an update, I will see a notice in the record, bright red here, that says check feedback and indicates to me that there is feedback needing to be processed on that record. Besides seeing feedback in the record itself, there is an area to review feedback on all of the records. It will be organized by, first you will see feedback on existing records for your agency at the top. So any records that are owned by the same agency that your login is assigned to will occur first at the top of the list. Next will be a list of new record suggestions that apply to everyone. Because a brand new record isn't yet associated with any particular agency, it potentially belongs to anyone, and so all new record suggestions are lumped together as the second item. Next, you can access feedback on records from other agencies, and finally, there's an area called publication feedback. Publication feedback does not mean feedback on the publication field. It means feedback on publication-related fields, specifically publication descriptions and general headings. Whether or not those things appear on a feedback form is determined by the person doing the setup of both the publication and the view that you're working in. On my particular form here, there are a number of publication fields listed here. You can see right here, these are publication fields that someone has added to this particular feedback form. If I decided to submit changes to this, you'll see that now I have a record of publication feedback. It's going to tell me the publication for which changes were suggested, in my case, and it would only have information about the particular fields related to that publication, and also any general information about the feedback that was submitted, such as the date it was submitted, the record it was submitted for, the IP address of the person who submitted it, where they submitted it from, and basic information about the feedback, like whether it was a full review and so on. And then it only has the particular changes that I made for the fields related to that publication. I'm just going to do a question check here. So that's how publication feedback differs. And you would, if in the same feedback form, if I had made changes to multiple different publications, so if I come back here and make a change not just to Club CN headings, but also another publication here, you'll see that I got two entries in the publication feedback. I got one for Club CN and one for Thursday, the Thursday publication code. So no matter how many different publications you have one entry for every single publication from that one feedback submission, and they're all processed independently. So even as I processed or deleted part of that publication feedback, you'll notice that it left the other half, okay? So each part of that is an independent piece, and likewise, the other parts of my submission, as I delete them, the other parts of my submission still remain. So if I delete the last feedback entry that I did that only changed publication fields, it's left my publication entries alone, okay? So as you process each component of the feedback, and that would apply to the taxonomy as well. So I indicated that you can do taxonomy feedback, but you can't, but it doesn't actually change it. It's going to preserve that information between. Pardon me.
Hi, I'm sorry, but we're having a little bit of an issue with Amara, and we're going to have to pause here for a few minutes because Amara is desperate for her mother and has been crying for her for the last half hour. So we're going to have a little pause.
When we did the taxonomy development, because it was viewed as unhelpful to have the public give taxonomy feedback, that it wouldn't be accurate, and it was just too much work. So actually, there is no taxonomy feedback option. It was in the design plans but got pulled. So ignore what I said about the taxonomy feedback. The only separate feedback we have is the publication feedback. And again, really sorry for the delay. Chris, are you recording again?
Yeah, we're recording again.
Okay. All right, now I'll need to get my brain together for a second to figure out where I was. Are we still having audio problems?
Deborah Doherty was complaining about audio problems, but I think that was because she was away and then back. And
okay. And the other good news is I have my helper back. So hopefully everything will go smoothly from this point on. So getting my brain back into things. So back to, I talked about the publication feedback and the fact that each part of the feedback is independent, and if you delete one part, it doesn't impact the other parts. The core part that has information about when the feedback was submitted, who submitted it, the data authorization, all of those components is saved until the very last piece of the feedback is gone. Okay? All right, next. While I'm here, I might as well do... I am sharing my screen. While I'm here, I'm going to talk a little bit more about this page and the things that you can do when you are reviewing feedback. One is obviously actually the view screen, which we popped into a few times already. This would include all of the details that were submitted, whatever the feedback was. So in our second feedback, we had a number of different changes. We changed that extra field, we changed the area served, a few pieces of the address, and so on. Okay. Includes all the data use authorization information. If the feedback was submitted by staff, it would include the login name and the agency of the staff member, the record, and so on. You have the option of going right to the record that the feedback was submitted on. Update would actually take us to the relevant update form, whether it be publication update or record update. So in the case of record update, here I am being taken right to the update form. You'll notice that I have feedback 1, 2, 3 here, whereas when we came back to this particular page, we're only seeing 2. Okay? And you'll recall that I had deleted that third piece of feedback, but there is still a component of it left to do with publication feedback. So the reason that you were seeing the 3 messages when we went to update is because that third piece that has the core information about the feedback, including the notes, the source information, the data use authorization, the day it was submitted, who submitted it, all those core pieces of information remain preserved until all aspects of that feedback are deleted. So if you run into this situation where you seem to have this hanger-on piece of feedback information that is only at the top, but you don't actually see any of the information in the record and you can't seem to process it away, generally that's because you're going to have a publication feedback sitting somewhere else, and that basic part of the feedback information won't go away until all the feedback has been processed. So that's why we see 3 different sets of messages here, even though when we're on our feedback page, there are only 2 for this particular record, 2 feedback on the record itself. It's because if we come down here, we have this particular entry here, which was related to that 3rd piece of feedback where we deleted the entry that was just the information about the fields that had been changed within the record itself. Finally, we have the option to delete, which obviously I had already shown you. When you do delete a piece of feedback, it's really important, as I have in red here, to remember that the person who submitted that feedback is not going to receive any automatic notification if you decide not to process their feedback. So if there's a reason why you need to get rid of feedback without processing it, most often this is a new record suggestion where it doesn't meet your policies about the kinds of information that you keep in your database. The polite thing to do is to take note of the email address if it's available or other contact information that would have been part of the submission, and to let that person know why their record was not included. Another case where you're likely to want to delete feedback without processing is cases where you get a member of the public submitting the feedback form thinking that they're contacting the actual organization, and in such a case you're likely to want to pass that information either onto the organization, or you want to contact the person who submitted it. Not a direct way to get in touch with that organization. I do know that that happens. So in those cases, it's important to potentially get the contact information down, print this out, whatever you need to do before you do actually delete the feedback. Okay. All of the columns in the feedback page have linked column heads, meaning that you can sort by any of the criteria at the top. So I can sort by record number, I can sort by who submitted it, the name of the organization, and so on. In this case, it's not going to do much good except in the date submitted column, because they're already in alphabetical order in all cases. Unlike the taxonomy area where you can do both ascending and descending, meaning you can flip it in reverse order, you cannot do this with this particular form. This is an older style sort, so it only allows you to do ascending, meaning from low to high, on any of the columns you click. And unfortunately, in the ones I have, it doesn't matter which column you click, they all sort exactly the same way, so I can't really demonstrate it. But that's the idea. It will only do ascending. It doesn't do ascending, descending. So it's whatever the last one that you click, that's the sort order that it's going to do it in. Does anyone have any further questions about feedback or suggest an update? They are exactly the same thing. Within the internal system, we try and call it feedback consistently, but for the public, we just designate it as suggest an update, which is why it ends up getting labeled suggest an update here, because that is also the link that the public sees. But be aware that suggest an update and feedback are exactly the same thing. Okay. While I'm at it, I'm going to show you, in the case of the publication feedback, I realized I forgot to show you 2 things. One, in the record itself, you'll notice that we also have a check pub feedback note. Besides our regular check feedback that we had here, you'll also see a flag that there's publication-specific feedback. And in the case of doing an update from the publication feedback, it's going to bring us to the publication update form. And you'll see, just like with a regular record update, you're going to see the feedback information at the top and information about the changes there at the bottom. The next thing I'm going to do is give a little bit of a demonstration about how we actually process that feedback. So I'm going to go to Update Record. And as I indicated earlier, Update Record is where we actually make changes to the record. So anything that we submit from Update Record will instantly change that record. So it is an immediate change. It is an unreversible change, and that's the main way that it differs from submitting feedback. One of the things that I didn't specifically point out in the feedback form were these little question marks at the side. The question marks are a pop-up window indicating the field help for that particular field. If you do not have field help, it's mainly because you haven't filled it out. So we don't have an official set of field help, unfortunately. In particular for the community information side, what we have was donated by, I believe it was Halton, back more than 5 years ago. And although we can distribute that to anyone who wants, it's not suitable as is. It would need to be adjusted to your local practices. And although we do hope in the future to offer the addition of a standards item for any of the fields that follow, say, the Inform Ontario standards, at the moment we do rely on our members to put their own field help into their system. So the field help management work into being consistent and following standards. So once we get into the session that's on setup, we will be talking about how to update your field help and make sure that you do have accurate, up-to-date instructions for the data managers in the form. In some cases, you'll see the letter F. This letter F only applies on the update form. It only applies to records that are bilingual, meaning in more than one language. When I'm on the English form, I'm going to see an F for French, and when I'm on the French form, I'm going to see one for English. So if I click on the F, it's going to give me a pop-up window indicating the equivalent version of that field in the French record. This is not a good example because it's just got some random text, but what it would do is show me the contents of that field for that record in that language. So if, in order to keep both the English and the French consistent, because you update only in one language at a time, having the ability to view the information in the other language is important to make sure you maintain consistency. Whenever you update a bilingual record, such as this one, you always update the English first and the French second. So the French information always relies on certain parts of information in the French record. The first thing I'm going to do is just cover a bit about the feedback and stick on that side for a moment, so processing feedback. I filled out multiple different kinds of fields to give you a bit of an indication about how the feedback system works with each of those kinds of fields. In the case of a drop-down field, even though this says number 1, it's going to pick the appropriate one from the list, in this case Ward 1. Even though it doesn't just say 1, it has a bunch of additional information. The software knows to pick the correct value from the list. So with the case of a drop-down, you should be able to just click the Update button and have it choose the appropriate value. The same holds true for a text field. Any plain text field, whether it be a short box such as this one for Org Level 1, or a large box such as this one for Extra H, you should be able to just click the update button and have it fill in that information directly back into the form. It's important, obviously, to review the changes before you accept them, considering that it will completely overwrite the entire field. And the changes that are listed is going to be a complete repeat of the entire field. So in the case of a very large description, it may not always be clear what exactly the person has changed in the description. I'm going to take a moment here to highlight to you a particular tool that I use that some of you may be interested in using for yourself. And in my case, I use a version of this tool called WinMerge, but there are a lot of similar kinds of tools out there. The idea is a tool which compares two pieces of text to each other. And the way that it works is, I'll take a really large piece of text here, if I can find one. Okay, so let's say I take these two pieces of text and I remove some of the text in one case. By clicking refresh, it's going to highlight to me that one area of the text is different from another. So this is a really, really effective tool for data managers because you don't have to scan in disgusting detail two giant descriptions to identify what minor change prompted it could be as minor as a spacing difference or a comma, and you trying to go through and figure out what it is that they've changed so that you can review and approve that change can be very challenging. One of the things that is important to note about a tool like this is it's checking on a line-by-line basis. So if you do have one very long run-in line, it's only going to be able to locate the differences on a line-by-line basis. But there are lots of tools out there, other than this one. This is just the one that I use. There are lots of tools out there that can assist you in identifying changes that people make. And if you feel that having a tool like this would be beneficial to you, I really do encourage you to go out and find one of these tools. There's lots of free ones out there, and it may be able to assist you in this kind of a process. Does anyone have any questions on that? Okay. So moving back to our form, we're going to, another little trick I'm going to just highlight to you. For finding feedback, if you've had, if you're just processing feedback and you don't want to scroll through a giant form, I'm using a little trick in Firefox. I'm hitting a slash key and then typing the word in quick find feedback. Okay. Then I can hit Control-G to skip from one feedback to another so that I don't have to go through the entire giant form to find all of the feedback in the record. So in this case, I have a multi-part field. You'll notice that in the multi-part field, each section of the feedback is an independent thing to update. So I would have to individually update the street type, the street direction, and the suffix. They all have their own feedback area and their own update button if it applies. Finally, I'm going to keep searching for feedback. This is the last kind of feedback that we might be able to get. And you'll notice that there is no update button. So for certain special fields, like checklist fields, where, if you'll recall on the feedback form, there were no checklists, the software is unable to clearly indicate to you what changes were made and automatically process those. There certainly has been a lot of desire expressed to be able to do this in a more automatic way, but unfortunately, for the time being, you're going to have to do it the manual and long way, and that is you have to review feedback on checklists in two meticulous ways. First, you have to identify whether any items have been removed. So looking at my list up here, I only have Oakville. I would have to check that Oakville was still in the list down here. So if I had Oakville and my feedback didn't say Oakville, it only said Burlington, Hamilton, that would be an indication to me that I needed to remove Oakville from the list because it no longer applied. In this case, Oakville is still in the list, so I can leave the existing Oakville, but I need to add Burlington and Hamilton in order to complete this feedback, and I have to do it manually. Okay? So that applies to all of the checklist fields, the languages, the accessibility, the areas served, the fee types, the funding. It applies equally to all of those fields. In the case of funding, some components of the funding field, or the fee type field, pardon me, such as the fee assistance information or the other notes, those would potentially be available with an update button as a separate component, but the part that is a checklist component would have to be manually, okay? So do be aware that you're going to receive the information in pieces, potentially. So you would get one update that applied to this section and the other, and you would get one for the fee assistance, potentially. Okay, next. All right, so we're going to talk a little bit more about the update form in general. That was specifically around process. I'll do one more piece of processing feedback, and that is at the very bottom of the form, you will see the yes, no towards deleting the feedback. It only applies to deleting the feedback in a particular language. When I'm updating the English record, I can only ever delete English feedback. When I'm updating the French record, which as I had indicated earlier always comes second, I would have the option of deleting either or both of French and English because in many cases I want to carry over the English feedback over to where I'm updating the French so that I have something in front of me to indicate how to make an equivalent change to the French information to whatever was requested of the English information. So you do have the ability to carry over your feedback into the French form to complete the update, and then you can delete either English or French feedback from the French part of the form. We've had a number of requests in the past about moving this delete feedback up to the top of the form. There are reasons why we haven't done it that way, and they mainly have to do with accidentally getting rid of the feedback, especially because, and also the other request that we will often have is about changing the default to yes. So again, it really is a case of being concerned that the feedback might disappear before it's processed, so the default is always going to be on the side of making it difficult to accidentally get rid of the information. And so that's why we've never changed the default to deleting the feedback. It's just too dangerous. And although it does obviously take a moment to click over and make it delete, it's that way to protect you and make sure that the information doesn't get deleted by accident. I'm going to talk a little bit about the various fields in the update form. Most of them are specific to community information side, so I'll talk a little bit about the generic fields first that have to do with these ones at the top that just have to do with general record maintenance. Then I'll talk about some specific community information fields and what they're for, Finally, I'll flip over to the volunteer update form and talk specifically about some of the fields on that form. So certain data management fields apply no matter what kind of a record you're working with. The update date indicates the last time the entire record was reviewed. You may or may not have the ability to do a full update. A full update, also having the privilege to do a full update of the record also gives you the privilege of deleting the feedback. The reason is this. The intention is that you would only give full update privileges to a person who has access to all the fields that you use for the record, whereas there may be other people who have privileges to update only a subset of the information in the record. By confining full update privileges only to people who have the ability to modify all the fields in the database, you can be sure that you don't run into a situation where someone isn't seeing part of the feedback because they don't have access to update those fields. Let's take an example where you had a third-party partner and you gave them a couple of your extra fields to use as they please, and you gave them only update privileges of those two extra fields, but not anything else. Obviously, it would be a major, major problem if they were able to get rid of feedback on a record that where they couldn't even see in their update form all of the other changes that might have been suggested to that record beyond just the two extra fields that you had given them. Obviously, they can't review the entire record and therefore are not capable of doing a full record update of that record. So even though they had been given some permission to modify certain kinds of fields in the record, they don't have permission to update a sufficient number or sufficient amount of the records to truly do a full update of the record. So that's why we have that security in there where the person who configures the permissions and the security of the database should be conscious of who is given the privilege to do a full update, which involves, processing the update date and processing the feedback and so on. So when I do a new update date, like so, that is used in combination with this other field, update schedule, to indicate when a record is due to be updated and when it was last updated. Together, we can tell whether a record has gone past due, meaning the schedule has passed and we still haven't updated the record. So if I say that the record needs to be updated on the 27th of April and I have updated it 27th of October, I've gone past, or if this date goes past, I know that I need to update that record. So these are all components that say when was the last time I updated it, who updated it, when is it next due to be updated. So those apply both to community information and volunteer and are an indication of the quality of the record in terms of when how up-to-date it is. Whether you pick a 6-month, 1 year, 18 months has to do with your individual data contracts that you have and how up-to-date your records need to be, how often a particular record requires updating. So certain records in your database may change so frequently that they need to be checked on a more regular basis. So then you might choose a 6-month timeline instead of a 1-year timeline. Depending on the kind of detail you might keep for child care records, those are often records where change can be more frequently than on a yearly basis, depending on the level of detail of information you're keeping on them. And finally, there is another field in the database called the update history, which we don't see here, but is automatically changed whenever we change our update date. So by putting in a new update of 27th of October, the previous update date, which I'm going to retrieve right now, the previous update, which was 30th of January, when I make this change, it will automatically add the previous date in January to my update history field, okay? So anytime I change update date, it has a knock-on effect of automatically changing update history as well. You don't have the ability to modify the update history. That's done automatically by the software, and it's only changed when you change the update date. Any questions about those particular fields? In addition to that, there are a few other data management fields that are generic, that are generally used by, can be used by any kind of record. Collection information, so when was the information collected and who collected it, and a second set of information called the created and the created by is going to be generated automatically by the database whenever a brand new record is created. So that may be different from the time that the information was initially collected, whether that be by fax, by feedback, and so on. So if someone suggests a new update and you don't actually create that record until 2 weeks later, you may want to capture that you collected that information the day that the feedback was submitted. The other data management field that's set automatically by the system is the last modified date and the last modified by. This is really important to have the system set this on automatically, because if we do run into a situation where something negative has happened to a record, there has to be some kind of traceability where you can be sure of which account actually made the changes to the record, whereas the update and the updated by are, they're kind of a judgment call. So only the data manager can decide whether the kinds of changes that were made warrant having it be a full update, meaning a case where you've reviewed every single field in the database. That's why changing the updated by and updated date information is left at the discretion of the data manager to say whether, yes, this is truly a full one, as opposed to the modified by, which is kept sort of for security reasons to make sure that there's some traceability about who is modifying records. So if there is an issue, there's an absolute way we can go back and see who the last person to make a change to the record was. Okay? The last modified by and last modified are set no matter where the record was changed, so whether it be here through the update form or through one of the other tools that we'll talk about in another session, like find and replace tool and so on. Doesn't matter how that record was changed, it's still going to update this last modified and last modified by. Okay. I'm not going to get into huge detail about the specific fields, partly because we do have standard bodies to explain the majority of the standard fields, and at any time anyone can approach and say, you know, I don't understand what this field is intended to do. Instead, I'm going to talk about a few specific fields where a little bit more thought is involved, or there needs to be a little bit more of an explanation about how to effectively use these fields. The first one I'm going to talk about are the various name fields. So CIOC uses the Inform Ontario naming structure, which is a 5-level structure. The intended purpose of this is to associate records that have the same, that are part of the same organization together by sharing a hierarchy in their naming. So organizations that have the same top-level parent organization should be able to be connected automatically in the software by virtue of having the same org level 1. Whereas we can get down to lower levels where specific programs, specific branches of those organizations have lower and lower levels of the hierarchy, can also be associated as siblings of one another and as belonging to the same parent, either the same parent programs, the same parent organizations, by virtue of having the same naming structure. So it is really important that you get the naming correct. Otherwise, the software's ability to connect these records together for you is really hampered. If you put in Bob's, Bar and Grill, and you put Bob apostrophe S, and then you have Bob's Bar and Grill with no apostrophe, the system can't recognize those two records as belonging together, as being connected together. So having naming consistency is extremely important. And one of the easiest ways to identify whether or not you are being consistent in your naming is to, every once in a while, go to your Browse by Organization page. And review this alphabetical list of names to see whether or not you're effectively naming your records with exactly the same names. One of the other ways to really here's a perfect example. Provincial Progressive Conservative Association and Provincial Progressive Conservative Party Association. Because these two have two different Org Level 1 names, when I go into the record, no link. Okay? If I were to update that record to have the same name as the other record did, so add the word party, now these records have been effectively associated with one another as they should be. So I can click on Provincial Progressive Conservative Party Association and identify that these two records are connected to one another. They belong to the same parent organization. Okay, so that is the other way to effectively know whether you are properly naming your records, is by going into the record and clicking on these linked organization names and testing the search to see if it's bringing up the right records. There are very deceptive ways that this can be blocked from happening. So I'll give you an example. I'll go back to that record I just updated, and I'm going to add an extra space. So I added 2 spaces between the word conservative and the word party. And you'll see now the name is not linked. However, if I went to you'll see that they look exactly the same in the search results. There's no obvious way when I'm examining these 2 names that I would be able to tell that they're not exactly the same. That's because HTML hides extra spaces. If you accidentally put in a space, the only way that you will ever know that is by going in and looking for it in the update form. That's the only place where you'll actually see the extra space. One of the things that I'll go through in one of the future sessions in Find and Replace is that you can go through and look for extra spaces, for example, and eliminate those to try and deal with problems like this. But I just want to highlight to you how important it is that these names be exactly the same. And we do have tools for things like global name changes to help you keep that consistency. So once you have it in place, you can make sure that you keep naming consistency by doing your name changes in bulk. If some parent organization has a name change, if you change all the records at the same time to the same value, you know 100% that you're going to be preserving that naming structure. Okay. Does anyone have any questions about that naming structure and how that works? Okay. Next to each organization name that is lower than organization level 1, you're going to see this Publish as Cross-Reference button. So one of the things that we covered in last week's session was doing print reports and generating a name index. And we indicated that this was the place where if you wanted to publish a particular name as a cross-reference, oh, and I should mention here that you should never leave blank organization names. The software lets you do it, don't do it. It's really, really bad practice, and it will interfere with the software's ability to match up records with one another in their hierarchy. So you never ever leave blank levels when you're doing these names. So I wouldn't fill in org level 3 without filling in org level 2 as well. by publishing one of these names as a cross-reference, I make it available in print reports in a name index. That's the only purpose for this, okay? If you do not generate name indexes, you have no reason to mark any of your names as cross-references. This is solely for the purpose of printed publications and the ability to list this name in an alternate form within a publication name index. This is usually because even though you're listing that entire hierarchy of how this particular program or branch fits in to a larger organization structure, when a regular old human being is going and trying to find that organization, they're not necessarily going to search for it by the name of the parent organization. They may use one of many other forms of the name. Maybe it's the specific program name, maybe it's the legal name, maybe it's the alternate name. So this gives you the ability in your publications to list these records by whatever names you think that the public is most likely to search for them by. So in this case, I would potentially want to list this alternate name, MCHD Oakville, so that it also appeared under that listing if anyone was looking for it. Besides the alternate name, the legal name, we do also have a former name. So whenever an organization changes their name, you can indicate the previous name of the organization and the date of the change. The date of the change does not have to be a specific date. It could be just a year. And in fact, in most cases, it should only be just a year. It does do a sort by year, so it turns the year into a number. So if I put 2006, and then I do another one that's 2008, it's going to sort them in the order of the year. So if you do put those years in, then when you actually view the former org field, it's going to display the year next to the name and sort them in the order of the year of change. You see here this old cross-reference field. This is simply an extra field that someone has renamed as old cross-reference, so please ignore that. It is not really a name field. This is actually an extra field. And you may have an extra field in your database called old cross-reference. If you do and you're not using it, you can rename it to something else because it's not really a cross-reference field. It's simply an extra field. The logo field. So for any of you who do wish to use a logo field, the logo field is displayed a little bit differently from the rest of the record in that it'll appear in the header of the record. So it would appear over here. If I added a link to an image, this is where it would appear in the record as opposed to down here. The logo address has to be an existing image somewhere on the internet. Please be very careful linking to sites that you do not control for so many reasons. One, you don't want to have it be broken because obviously that looks poorly if you end up with a broken image. But it can be worse than that. I have certainly in my internet experience seen cases where people have linked to other people's images and those images have been replaced with other things, sometimes unsavory other things. It is extremely risky if you have a public site like this to link to images where you have no control. So although it can seem very appealing to link to logos on other people's websites, unless you have a specific arrangement with that organization and they know that you're linking to their logo, don't do it. Likewise, if you are going to host that logo yourself, because that logo is the intellectual property of the other organization, you need to have their permission for that too. So my blanket advice here is don't ever add logo fields to your database without the explicit advice and consultation of the organization whose logo that you are using, okay? They are copyrighted images. You can't just use them. You certainly can't just link to them on other sites without taking on some risk if you're not in discussion with that organization. So although this can be a really useful and attractive feature to add to your site, it should be done with a certain amount of forethought. Any questions or concerns about that? All right, next, located in communities. These values come out of our communities table. If you have any questions about the setup of the communities table, that's going to be covered in a future session. The important thing to note here is, one, the value that you choose must come out of the communities table. If you don't know the value to use, you use the community finder, which allows you to search for specific communities. We covered this a bit in last week's session. When you do search for a community, it's going to show you the name of the community, which community it's located in, and if there are any more refined communities within that area, it would show those as well. My general advice is that you always use the most specific community available when doing a located in community search. The software has an understanding of the fact that narrowly defined communities, such as Hamilton West, is located in these larger communities like in Hamilton, in the city of Hamilton, in southern Ontario, and so on. So you do not have to worry that someone is going to do a search for, let's do a better one. We'll take Ancaster. If I enter Jerseyville as the located in community, and someone searches for Ancaster, you do not have to worry that that record will not be located. The software understands that Jerseyville is part of Ancaster. Whereas, if I chose the located in community to be Ancaster, and someone did a search for Carluke, even though that record is actually located in Jerseyville, it's going to match because I have said it's in Ancaster, which is a large area, and Ancaster contains both Alberton, Carluke, Duff Corners, and Jerseyville. And therefore, the software has no way of knowing that that record isn't really in Carluke, it's really in Jerseyville, unless you, the data manager, puts that record is in Jerseyville. And that's why it's so important to be as narrow as you can when defining your communities. That said, there is another consideration, and that is consistency. It can look very poor to have a zillion different communities defined in your search results, and many people want to have very consistently defined and easily recognizable values when people get their search results. Go back to right here. So people want to have very consistently defined values in their search results because, one, it's attractive, two, it's very easy for people to understand and identify that information. So how do you balance these two things? Get as narrow as you possibly can and have search results that look consistent and are easy to comprehend for the person doing the search. There are a few different ways that you can deal with this, but my general advice is that at the minimum, you keep your located in communities consistent with the search communities that you offer on your basic search page. So take this as an example. If I'm offering Jerseyville as a place where that person doing this search is allowed to search, then it's really important that I index down to the level of Jerseyville. If I'm never allowing the public to go down, or anyone for that matter, to go down to the level of Jerseyville, it's less important that my located ins go to Jerseyville. But when choosing, my very strong advice is as narrow as possible. The quality of your search results is always going to be better if you are more specific. So in the end, it's a judgment call for you, the data managers, to decide what is the most important thing to you. Is it how the search results display, or is it how effectively the people can search? There is a third option, and that is the person who's doing the community setup does have the ability to create a display name for a community. So if you had a very narrow community, but a lot of people wouldn't understand what that community meant, let's say Jerseyville was quite obscure, and not everyone who was doing a search would necessarily know what Jerseyville was. You could, in the display name, call it Jerseyville and then in brackets Ancaster, so that when your search results displayed, it would say Jerseyville and Ancaster, so that people could identify that particular, or sorry, in your search form here, it would say Jerseyville, Ancaster. It gives you the ability to be more explicit for the person doing the search. But my overall recommendation is just be as narrowly defined as you can. If you have chosen to set up your communities with these small communities, these narrowly defined communities, then use them. Be as narrow and specific as you can. When you contribute your information to larger scale databases, such as 211ontario.ca, if those narrow communities are not part of 211ontario.ca, it will automatically use the higher level community. When you export that record, it includes the parent authorized community. So if Jerseyville wasn't an authorized community, it was some local thing that you had set up for your database, when you shared that information to 211ontario.ca, they would also be sent Ancaster, and they would be able to use Ancaster. So that should not be a concern to you, to use those locally narrowly defined communities, because the authorized higher level community will automatically be included when you share that information. Okay, just to keep in the same universe here, I'm going to skip down to areas served, which have the exact opposite effect. The areas served should always be quite broadly defined, and by that I mean if, for instance, this wasn't Oakville and Burlington, but Oakville, Burlington, Halton Hills, Milton, if it was really all of the components of Halton Region, then I should be indexing the areas served to Halton Region rather than selecting those individual communities. And likewise, it's entirely unnecessary to index to both the highly defined, the broadly defined community, such as Halton Region, and also include the narrowly defined communities, such as Oakville, because the software understands that Oakville is inside of Halton Region. There is no reason to put both Oakville and Halton Region in the same record, right? In terms of searches, the software is, again, very generous. So if I say that this particular record serves Jerseyville, then someone looking for services in Ancaster would match that record. And the same is true in reverse. If I say that this record serves Ancaster and someone does a search for Jerseyville, it's going to match this record. So the matching is very, very generous. At the same time, you do need to be accurate. You don't want to include, if it really does serve only Jerseyville and not all of Ancaster, it's very important to put Jerseyville and not Ancaster, because someone searching for Duff's Corners, which was another community in Ancaster, you don't want them searching Duff's Corners and coming up with a record that only serves Jerseyville because you decided to index it to Ancaster instead of the more narrowly defined Jerseyville, which would have given more accurate search results. In both of these fields, both the located and areas served, number one is be as specific and accurate as possible. Your search results really do depend on having very accurate information in these fields. You do have the option when filling out your area served, just like all checklist fields, you do have the option of being specific with notes. So if I can say Burlington except downtown, can be a little bit specific and indicate to someone reviewing the record that there are restrictions around that particular service area. In addition, there is the boundaries field, which you see here, which gives you the opportunity to give very specific boundaries to the catchment area if there are specific boundaries defined. It also gives you the option of being a little bit generous. So I can say Burlington and surrounding area to indicate that although the general area served as Burlington, if you happen to live outside of the border, they're not going to necessarily deny you service just because you happen to be on the other side of the border. However, officially speaking, they're really only serving Burlington. They don't officially serve the outlying areas, but at the same time, it isn't a strict condition of if your house is on the other side of the street and you're in Oakville, then you cannot access this service. Okay. I'll talk a little bit about all of the general checklist fields. So most of the checklist fields in the database look like this, with a list of checklists and a list of notes. The notes are a place for you to be elaborate about the details. So if it was English, but only, or French, but only part-time, or French, but limited, it gives you a chance to give some kind of general information about that particular item that you selected. This applies to all the checklist fields. And any of the checklist fields, you also have the ability to give general notes, meaning things that don't apply to any of the predefined values, or places where you have to clarify as a whole as opposed to clarifying on a particular checklist item like this. It could be, please inquire. So just general information that isn't applicable to any specific language. That's what you can put in the other general notes. Languages is a special field. It's a combination of what we saw above in area served, where we manually type the names. So Dutch, for instance, or Italian is in our list. You can add extra values as long as they're in the grand list of values. The list that you see here is only a subset of all the available languages in the system, and the person doing the setup decides which ones are available on your form. But there may be a number of other languages available to you to add as a checklist. They just aren't part of your form. So that's something that's decided by the person who does the setup of your database. And if you tried to add a language here that wasn't part of the official list of languages in your database, you would receive an error message telling you, and you would have to either add it to your list of languages or you could put it in other general notes. Okay, other fields I want to cover. I'm going to cover the details of the subject field in the thesaurus and the NAICS field in the classification system session that we have later in next month. Okay, and distribution codes. Unlike publication codes, you can manage your distribution codes, and you do manage them directly in the record, or you can manage them as a bulk operation. You have to use codes that exist in the distribution table. So if you try and add codes here that do not exist, the software will give you a message indicating that particular code that you added doesn't exist. Code should be separated by semicolons. It doesn't matter. The spacing doesn't matter, so that would be fine, just as long as there's a semicolon anywhere in between the codes that you specify. To remove a code, you simply uncheck it. Okay. So the last thing I want to cover here, which is related to searching, is ages, and then I'll talk a little about mapping, and we're done with this form. Ages is part of the eligibility field. And although you are not required to specify a minimum and maximum age for every record, if you wish to use the age search option built into the software, it's important that your records are updated to reflect the minimum and maximum ages that apply to that record. By default, if I do not specify a minimum and maximum age in my record, that record will turn up in every single age-based search that I do, whether it be the age search on the basic search page or on the advanced. Every single search it will apply, because the assumption is if I haven't filled out a minimum or maximum age, then there is no minimum or maximum age for that record. Okay? So it's important to be explicit about the minimum and maximum age that applies if you plan on using the age search within the software. If you don't use the age search, then there's no need to be explicit unless you want to in terms of the quality of the data. The public, give the public access to the age range searches, then it's incredibly important that your data reflect realistic age information for the search. So even though that particular organization might not have a strict limit, for instance, they might say, it might not officially say that it doesn't serve children, but in effect, no child would ever use the program, and it wouldn't be appropriate for a child to use the program, then that's a likely case where you should be putting in the minimum age is 16 or 18, and in your eligibility notes you can be more explicit that although there is no explicit or enforced age restriction, that the program really only applies to adults or seniors or whatever the case may be. So you can be, it allows you to get accurate search results, but also give accurate information to the public. I'm sorry that we're probably going to run over because of my little delay, but does anyone have any questions about the update form before I move on? I'm going to do emailing update requests next. Okay. Next, I'm going to do. Actually, before I do that, I want to talk really briefly about creating a French record. So this particular record already had a French component to it. If this record did not have a French component, I would see a link to create an equivalent record, which will copy the existing English information, give me the ability to edit it, and then become the French component of the record. Not all aspects of the record are available for editing in a French record. So certain aspects like the postal code or the street direction or distribution codes, which can automatically be carried over from the English record to the French, are done so automatically. And when we go to the French version of the update record form, certain fields will not even be there. So distribution field would not be here. And if I go to areas served, it's not going to say areas served. You'll see that I don't have the ability to specify the communities. I only have the ability to create French notes. Okay? That's because the fact that this record serves the community of Oakville applies whether I'm viewing this record in English or in French. And if Oakville had a name that was different in French, the software would automatically be able to translate that name for you. So you wouldn't need to re-enter that information. The same thing applies to languages or any of the other checklist fields. And you'll notice that in the case of the ages that we just looked at, if there was ages information specified, because that's just a number, that would automatically be carried over to the French without you having to update it. So again, in the case of languages, you'll see that English was automatically carried over, but I would have the ability to update the notes about that if I wanted to. And again, the E allows me to view the English version of that field. As a data manager, I may or may not be allowed to delete the record or delete the French version of the record. So if I no longer wanted that copy of the French part of the record, I can remove just the French part and leave the English part. I'm going to hop to volunteer side just for a moment. Many of the fundamentals apply, so we have checklist fields that may or may not have notes, like this. So the fundamentals are exactly the same. You have the ability to select individual checklist items into notes. We have two really special fields, one being and the most important in my opinion, being the number of volunteers needed field. This field must be filled out. You must have at least one value greater than 1 in one of these communities, or that record will not be available effectively in searches, okay? Opportunities you have available and in which communities. You have the option of being explicit. If I have 3 everywhere down here in this record, but what I really mean is that the total is 3 opportunities, I may want to be explicit in the general notes, but I'm saying that that 3 can come from any one of these communities. These communities are predefined in the setup of the software, and we've covered that in a past volunteer training session. And we may be able to get into that at our volunteer training session next week for anyone who's unclear about it. But it's incredibly important that this information be filled out effectively. In addition, there is one more very special piece of information that is part of the update process of a volunteer record. After I submit the updates of a volunteer record, I have the opportunity to update the second component of the record, which is the areas of interest. That is the classification system that is part of the volunteer software. If you must have at least one area in which this record is classified. If you don't, then this record will not effectively be available to people doing searches. So you would see a list of the existing classifications of the record, and then you would have the opportunity to locate additional areas and add them. And here you can see you can remove existing areas of interest from the record. So that is very critical, that you must have minimum one classification of this record in order to have it work effectively in searches. Now notice I have the ability to go back to the record details without modifying the classification system. So if I come to this page and I see that the existing classification system is just fine, I can go right to the record details without doing any modification. But if I either want to remove from the list or add new ones, then I have to go through the step-by-step process, which allows me to remove existing classifications or add new ones. Finally, I want to talk a little bit about expired records. In addition to the update date, the update schedule, and all of those dates that apply to the community information record, the volunteer record has another really, really important date, which is called display until. The display until date is a way for a record to expire. So many volunteer opportunity postings are very time sensitive, and a summer-based opportunity, for example, it does not need to be available for searching come fall. So the volunteer software allows you to set a date on which a record will disappear from view. It does not delete the record. It simply hides it from view. And as we covered last week, there are specific ways where you can retrieve that record. For instance, if you want to bring it current again the following summer, you do have the ability to retrieve that record again. So this display until date is very important. If you do not want the record to disappear automatically, do not put a display until date in the record, because it will be gone with no notice to you. It will just disappear when that date passes. Okay. So a little bit about email update requests. There are two kinds. One is applicable to both community information and volunteer, and one is applicable only to the volunteer side. So I'll start with the generic email update request. There are two ways to do an update request. One is directly from the record, just as I did there. And the other is what we call a bulk email update request, which I'll cover bulk operations in a future session, but they do exactly the same thing. So when you are customizing your email update request, there are certain parts of the message that you have the ability to change at the time that you send the information, and there are certain parts of the message that are predefined for the entire database, and only the super user can go in and make changes to those. If you do have a bilingual message, or a bilingual record, you will see that you have both the English section and the French section within the same email. If it is an English-only record, your request will be anything that you see in this template here that is in square brackets indicates that the software is going to automatically fill in some of that information for you. One of the new features in this particular version of the software is the ability to send out your request to a particular domain name. So for those of you that have multiple domain names where maybe you have different managers that each operate pretty much independent little databases that are really part of the same database, so that would be Chatham-Kent in the Windsor database, or Quinty in the Kingston database, or For Info in the Central East database. I can go on and on and on. You now have the ability to send out your update requests to your particular section of public area of the database, so that for all intents and purposes, it looks like this email is just coming from you. There's no evidence of the grander database that is behind your particular area of the database. By default, the email update request is going to go out through whatever is defined as the default view of your database. So there is always one default view in every database, whereas nothing else is specified. That is the database that the public go to. But you may have other public views specified in your database. Only if you have more than one will you see other items in this drop-down list. And only if you have configured other special views with different website addresses will you see other addresses like I have here, test.ciarc.info, sandbox.ciarc.ca, pardon me, where I could specify the specific address that was used when it generates the links in the email that the public will follow to view the record or to update the record. It is possible to send out update requests to records that are not part of the public view. So you can ask the public to update a record that they cannot access through your public website. What happens in that case is the link that says check this URL for your current listing, that is left out of the message, and they will only receive a link to the feedback page. So they will only receive the ability to go to the form and make the changes. They will not be able to view the underlying record. Once you've chosen where you want to send them to, which, as I said, it defaults to the regular public view, and for many of you, that's all you will need. You can make any modifications you want to certain specific areas of the text, such as the body of the subject. You preview the email message, and it will show you with all of the different changes that you had made to the message. Okay. And then by clicking Send the Email Message, it will actually send that message out. I'm in test mode right now, in training mode, so it's not actually going to send a message out. But you will see a report such as this one, which tells you to whom messages were sent, and if any of them failed for some reason, such as there not being an email address configured properly and so on, it would let you know that. Okay. When you have sent the email message, there is a special date in the record called the last email update request. That date will automatically be updated whenever this email goes out, so that you do have the ability to not harass people and only send messages out to people who have not had a request recently. Okay, so automatically once this message goes out, the software updates that email update, last email update request date in the record so that you know the last time that you sent them a message. Does anyone have any questions about email update requests? Again, I'm going to cover the bulk email update request in a different session when we're talking about bulk tools. Is there a question, Chris? No? Okay. All right, so next on my list, I'm going as fast as I can. We're going to talk a bit about deleted records. The software by default only deleted from the software. They are simply marked as being deleted, and in most cases would then disappear from your day-to-day work unless you explicitly tried to search for them. There are many reasons why we don't actually delete records from the database. One is they tend to be supportive of statistics and other information, and if we got rid of the record, we would lose our ability to retrieve those statistics and do that kind of analysis on those records. And so connected to that, if you do ever want to permanently delete your records, this is usually done in concert with a deletion of statistics and other related information so that you can archive all of these old statistics, old records, and then if you know that a record was deleted a year ago and you've gotten rid of all of your statistics that are older than 6 months ago, you can feel relatively confident that you can permanently delete that record without causing any problems to your ability to view and generate your statistical reports. Another area where you might run into a problem with deleting records is where you're trying to delete a community information record that is tied to a volunteer opportunity. If that volunteer opportunity is not also deleted, then you are going to run into a problem deleting the related community information record because the volunteer record that's associated with it relies on that underlying community information record. Similarly, if you have volunteer referrals, so where you have people have actually applied for a volunteer position, as long as you hold on to those volunteer referrals, it's important that you keep the associated volunteer record because in order to get accurate referral statistics, you still have to have that placeholder record for that volunteer opportunity, which gives the underlying information to generate the referral reports. So that's why, in general, we want to not permanently delete the records and remove them from the database, but rather mark them deleted so that for the purpose of our searches and day-to-day work, those records disappear. However, they still remain in place to support other activities. When you mark a record deleted, you have to specify the date on which it is deleted. That can be a date in the past, today, or in the future. A record that is deleted today or any day before today is immediately marked deleted. A record that is marked for deletion in the future will disappear and become deleted on the day after, or the day on which the deletion date occurs. So if I mark a record deleted for 2 weeks in the future, then it will continue to operate normally until the day that date passes. What you will see instead of the X that denotes a deleted record in your search results is the letter P, which indicates that that record is pending deletion. Anyone who has the power to delete a record also has the power to restore the record. Restoring the record, all it does is removes that deletion date. Okay, it's nothing more complicated than that. If I hit restore, it's going to remove the deletion date from the record, and it will then be in normal circulation again. In this case, I have the change date link, which allows me to change the date on which the record is either pending deletion or was deleted. And again, super users will have the ability to permanently delete the records and remove them from the database unless there is associated information that makes that impossible. Does anyone have any information on working with deleted records? And again, just to highlight the difference for the volunteer users between deleted records and expired records, records that expire, that have a display until date that passes, the intention with those records is that you may want to use them again in the future. So rather than saying this record is deleted, I never want to use it again, a record that expires, that has a display until date that passes, the assumption is that at some point in time you are going to want to retrieve that record and use it again. So you're not actually deleting it, rather you are setting a date on which it is no longer useful on a temporary basis, with the assumption that in the future you could go and find that record, update it, and bring it up to date again and use it again. Okay. Sorry for it being so compressed. I had intended to have more time for questions than this, and but if anyone has any questions on what I've covered today, please let me know. I know that a lot of your potential questions are actually going to be in the Setup and Advanced Activities session, which is, I think, 2 weeks from now. That's going to be all your bulk operations, find and replace, those kinds of activities. So we will be covering those, just not today. But if anyone has any questions on what I did today, on any specific fields, or has any particular advice to offer. Are we scheduled till 3:30?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. Here I am. I'm compressing myself more than I need to. I thought I was done at 3. Does anyone have any specific questions over what we've covered today? I have a little bit more time than I thought. So I can go into detail on any specific fields or any of those activities. Okay, well, if everyone is fine with that, I do really recommend that people attend the session on advanced activities, because those are going to be really critical to data managers, especially things like the find and replace, the bulk record operations. Those really are critical to data managers. I'll take a moment, though, and talk a bit about how safe searches might be helpful to data managers, since I have the time and I wanted to cover it. One of the things that you may want to do as a data manager, if you haven't already done so, is set yourself up with certain safe searches in your database that identify records that require attention. That may be records that have some kind of a data problem in them. I gave some examples of fields that really needed to be filled out in order to do effective searching for both volunteer and community information. So you can check for fields that don't have those values filled out. So for the volunteer software, I posted a search the other day for you to identify any of your volunteer opportunities that didn't have a number of positions specified. Likewise, you could do a search for any of your volunteer opportunities that didn't have any, that weren't classified, and I can go on and on. So it's really very helpful if you can identify certain challenging patterns in your data. Save yourself searches, share them with all of the data managers that work together, and have a periodic schedule in which you run those queries to identify potential problem records. Other queries that may be useful to you are so simple that they don't really require you to save them. And an example would be identifying records that require an email update request. That search would generally be comprised of last email update request, let's say more than 21 days. I don't want to harass them more than once every 3 weeks. I want to say the update schedule is in the past, meaning, or maybe in next month, so any that are coming due next month. And I want to see all the ones where I can send them a request. It can be none in this database, of course. It's because of my update schedule. I'll say, you know, pass. There we go. The records in here are old. So that would allow you to identify really quickly and easily all the records that have passed. Likewise, having the update schedule, for For data managers, I recommend having update schedule and select checkbox always in your view. Update schedule, you can see by the ones that are red that those records are overdue and need to be updated. The advantage of always having the select checkbox in your view is you can do everything from, picking small amounts of records on. You can do all your bulk operations. You can do your bulk email update requests and so on. So those are some really basic things that you're going to want to have in your search results 99% of the time. Any other data problem that I identify, I do tend to report on the bulletin board if I have a particular search that you can use to identify a data problem. You can do searches as simple as I had indicated records that had the double space in them. Even things like that are possible. But only through things like add SQL. So if you're not sure how to do a particular search, all you need to know is what you want to accomplish, and I can give you what you need to do it. So there you go. There's one I wasn't even involved in. So that brought up all the records that had double spaces in their org level 1, just as an example. But it is possible to do some really interesting, complex searches. For instance, I could give you a search that showed you all the records that didn't have any parent or sibling records, all the records that had no children. So it would help you identify all of those one-off or isolated records that maybe should be part of a larger set where maybe you haven't done the naming structure correctly and so on. I can even help you find case problems. So any kind of a data issue that you can identify, if you can describe to me how the problem occurs, I can probably provide you with a search to bring up those records and identify them. So please, I really strongly encourage you to do that. That's part of what I'm there for support. So if you can identify a pattern and you want to have an easy way to work with those records to help improve your data quality, please ask, because I'm there to do it. I'll give you the search parameters that you need, and we'll try and archive them in the FAQ. I do suggest to you, if you haven't gone through the FAQ, to look at some of those special searches that identify problem records and so on, that you take a little bit of time and look at the searches that are available there to you. Chris is indicating that some of the ones in the FAQ may be old enough that they're broken. If you run into that case, we can update them. So that isn't necessarily a reason. If you identify a search that is of interest to you and it isn't working, just let me know. I think that's about it. So we can wrap up now unless anyone has any questions. And again, I suspect most, if not all of you, are going to want to either attend or watch the recording of the session that's on advanced activities that has to do with some of the more useful bulk operations and setup activities and so on. And we will also have a session specifically on publications and views and so on. So any of those future sessions that apply to you, I encourage you either to attend if you can or to watch the recording after. Okay, so sorry about the interruption and sorry about the the volume problems that people were having. Hopefully the recording quality, the volume will be acceptable if anyone needs to go back to it. Thanks.